The winter of 1873 was a lesson in cold. In the Wyoming Territory, along a desolate stretch of the freight road, the wind had no reason to stop. It scoured the high plains, driving grit and ice against the thin, poorly chinked walls of Silas Vane's way station. It was November, and the world had frozen solid. Inside, the air was a bitter fog. Silas, a man in his late 50s, whose face was a map of sun-cracked roads and disappointment, stood by his cast-iron stove. It was the only source of warmth, and it was a tyrant. Feed it, and it glowed red-hot, scorching the air in a 10-foot circle, while the cabin's corners remained rimed with frost. Let it die, and the cold would claim the room in minutes. He was holding a loaf of bread. It was a grey, dense brick baked 2 days prior. He placed it on the rough-hewn plank table and drew his hunting knife. He had to put his weight on the handle, not to cut, but to score it, as if he were carving wood. The blade scraped, producing a shower of hard crumbs. He finally cracked the loaf open. The inside was a damp, solid mass, sour and cheerless. It was, he admitted, barely food. It was ballast. It was the taste of failure. This was the core of his problem. He had built the way station a year ago, hoping to profit from the teamsters and the occasional prospector, but his reputation was collapsing, not because of the cold, but because of his larder. Men could forgive a cold floor, but they could not forgive bad bread. Bread was the line between civilization and savagery. It was calories, it was comfort, it was the one thing a man could carry with him that tasted of home. And Silas Vane, despite having 60 sacks of good flour from the mill in Cheyenne, could not make it. He had tried. He had tried the way his mother had taught him back in Ohio, in a warm kitchen with a reliable oven. He would take the packet of expensive yeast he bought at the mercantile, proof it in warm water with a spoon of sugar, and mix his dough. He would set it in a bowl by the stove to rise, and he would wait. Hours later, the dough would be a cold, clammy, lifeless lump. The problem was the stove, or rather, the floor. The wind found its way under the door, under the sills, chilling the floorboards to the temperature of the ground outside. Even 3 feet from the roaring stove, the bowl would be sitting in a river of Arctic air. The yeast, that fragile, civilized life, would go dormant, and then it would die. What he baked was not bread, it was bannock, a quick, unleavened skillet bread full of baking soda and grit, that was hard as a stone an hour after it cooled. The last group of trappers who had stopped had left half a loaf on the table, a silent, damning judgment. Silas looked at the useless lump on his table, then at his hands, scarred from years of handling freight ropes and reins. He had faced blizzards, hostile territory, and broken wagons, but he was being defeated by a microorganism. He was failing to nurture life, and in this place, that failure was a death sentence. The standard method was a lie. It was a recipe for a gentler world, for insulated, clapboard houses in Ohio valleys, where the wind was a whisper, not a scream. Back east, a warm corner was a given. Here there was no warm corner. There was only the scorching radius of the stove and the Arctic waste that began 3 inches beyond it. Before building the station, Silas had driven freight. He had lived on hardtack, salt pork, and coffee. He knew how to survive, but he did not know how to live. And a way station, he was learning, had to be a place of living. His first winter, he had tried to follow the book. He built his cabin just as the settlement guide suggested. He had cut and notched his logs, chinked them with a mixture of mud and dried grass, but the wind was relentless. The chinking cracked and fell out. The mud froze, turned to powder, and vanished. The drafts were not just drafts. They were intrusions. He had wasted half his first winter simply trying to stay warm, his life reduced to the endless brutal labor of feeding the stove. He had tried everything to make the bread rise. He had tried setting the bowl on the stove's warming shelf, but that was too hot. It had cooked the dough, killing the yeast on the bottom while the top remained a cold paste. He had tried wrapping the bowl in his own wool blankets, but the blankets would be stiff with frost by morning. He had even tried, in a moment of desperation, sleeping with the dough bowl in his own cot, sharing his body heat. He had woken to a cold, slimy mess that had spilled over his bedroll. The waste of flour was catastrophic. Each failed loaf was dollars thrown into the wind, a mockery of his investment. His internal frustration was a cold, hard knot in his gut, tighter than the failed bread. Why was this so hard? He saw the smoke from other smaller cabins in the distance. Were they eating this same miserable fare? The few men he spoke to just shrugged. They ate skillet bread, jerky and beans. They accepted it. But Silas could not. The station was meant to be a refuge, a step up from the trail, and his failure to provide the most basic human comfort felt like a personal and profound flaw. He was not just failing as a baker, he was failing as an innkeeper, as a pioneer. He was just another man pretending to have tamed a land that was actively, hourly trying to kill him. He looked at the crock of store-bought balm he'd bought on his last trip. He'd kept it wrapped in wool, but a cold snap 2 nights ago had caught him unawares. He'd opened it this morning. It was still lifeless, another dollar, frozen to death. His first clue came not from a baker, but from a man who had no business being alive. In late January, a man named Sawtooth Jed stumbled into the station, his beard a solid mass of ice, his eyes wild from snow blindness. He was an old prospector, one of the half-mad hermits who chased rumors of color in the frozen creeks. Silas took him in, and for a week Jed recovered, sitting by the stove complaining. He was especially vocal about the bread. "Call this food, Vane," he'd croaked, tapping a piece of soda bread on the table. "This is ballast. You'll founder a man's guts with this." Silas, defensive, had retorted that nothing else was possible. Jed just laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "That's 'cause you're trying to make it, Vane. You don't make life. You herd it." The next morning, Jed pulled a small, greasy earthenware crock from his pack. It was stoppered with a wooden plug wrapped in rawhide. He opened it. The smell was sharp, acidic, and strangely fruity. It was alive. "This here," Jed said, tapping the crock, "is my mother. Came over the mountains in 52. Fed me when the snows hit," Jed explained in his grumbling way. It was a balm, a starter. It wasn't a packet. It was a colony. It didn't need sugar, just flour and water, and it didn't like being hot. It didn't like being cold. It liked being steady. "You gotta treat it like a baby, Vane," Jed had said. "A mean, hungry baby that's always cold." He showed Silas how he kept it. He never put it near the fire. He kept it in his pack, wrapped in his spare woolens, buried in the middle of his gear. He fed it every night. When he made bread, he didn't use a bowl. He made a well in the flour sack itself, poured in the starter and some water, and worked it into a dough, always leaving a bit of the mother behind in the crock. The second encounter was one of observation. A small group of Shoshone traders passed through, bartering for tobacco. Silas watched as one of the women, moving with quiet efficiency, prepared a small meal. He noticed a small, tightly woven basket, almost the size of a fist, lined with what looked like rabbit fur. She kept it tucked inside her robes. He saw her open it, take a pinch of something, and add it to a mash of crushed roots. He realized she was carrying her own leaven, her own mother, using her own body heat and the insulation of the fur-lined basket to keep it alive. The final piece of the puzzle came from the land itself. After a heavy storm, he was digging out a snowdrift that had buried his woodpile. He plunged his arm deep into the drift, and to his shock, the snow near the bottom was not as cold. In fact, right against the ground, the earth was unfrozen. The deep, packed snow wasn't the cold, it was an insulator. It was a blanket trapping the earth's meager warmth, a living starter, insulation, a stable temperature, not a hot one. Silas looked at Jed, who was dozing by the fire. He made a decision. He traded a full bottle of whiskey, a steep price, for a single precious scoop of Jed's sour, bubbling mother. Jed handed it over in a small jar. "Don't kill it, Vane," he warned. "It's older than this whole damn territory." That night, Silas Vane did not sleep. He sat by the dying stove, the small jar of Jed's starter cradled in his hands, feeling its faint residual warmth. He had a living thing to protect. But how? He couldn't wrap it in his bedroll every night. He couldn't carry it in his shirt like the Shoshone woman. He had to build it a home. He had to engineer a space that was not hot and not cold, but steady. He thought about the snowdrift. He thought about Jed's pack. He thought about the fur-lined basket. The principle was insulation. The goal was thermal stability. He was thinking like an engineer. His eyes scanned the dim cabin falling on the stove. The stove was the enemy, the source of the wild. Swinging temperatures, but it was also the only source of heat. What if he could tame its heat? What if he could capture its runoff? He walked to the side of the stove. The floor 2 feet away was freezing. The wall directly behind it was scorching. But the side of the cast-iron box about 18 inches away was just warm. The air there was pleasant. He held his hand there. It was a stable, gentle warmth. He had a plan. He found an old crate that had once held tinned goods. It was rough pine, but it was solid. He would build a box, an insulated box, a bomb box. He had no rabbit fur, but he had other things. He had an old moth-eaten wool shirt. He had a sack of sawdust from his woodcutting. He spent the next day on the project, the storm howling outside. He meticulously lined the pine crate with the wool shirt. Then he packed the space between the wool and the wood with sawdust, packing it down tight until the walls were 3 inches thick, dense, and solid. He built a small sliding lid and insulated it the same way. It was ugly. It was a BAME box, he thought. Ugly, but perhaps functional. He placed the finished box on the floor, 18 inches from the side of the stove. He put his hand inside. It was just a cold box. It needed heat, but not much. He looked at the hearth. He had a few small soapstones he used as hand warmers. He took one, placed it on the top of the stove for 10 minutes, until it was warm to the touch, but not hot enough to burn. He placed the warm soapstone inside the bomb box. He put the precious jar of starter next to it. He closed the lid. He waited an hour, then checked. He put his hand inside. It was not hot. It was not cold. It was milky, warm. It was the temperature of a living thing. But this only solved the first problem, keeping the starter alive. The second problem was the bread itself. Even if it rose, how could he make it last? Standard bread went stale in this dry, cold air in 12 hours. He needed a bread that would stay soft for days, even weeks. He thought back. Years ago, his grandmother, who had survived the famine in Ireland, had talked about it. When flour was scarce, what did they use to stretch it? What did they use to add moisture and substance? The answer hit him with the force of a revelation. Potatoes. He had a root cellar full of them. They were cheap, they were filling, and they were full of starch and moisture. He would not just make sourdough, he would make a potato sourdough. It would be a 2-day process. He would have to boil the potatoes, mash them, save the starchy water, and use that to feed the starter and make the dough. It was more labor, it was complex, but if it worked, he wouldn't just be making bread, he would be creating a true survival food. That evening he began. He boiled 3 large potatoes, the earthy steam filling the cabin, a welcome change from the smell of smoke and old grease. He mashed them smooth. He took the grey, starchy water they had boiled in, let it cool to milky warm, and fed it to the starter in its new barm box. He closed the lid. He went to bed, listening to the wind, his mind focused not on the cold, but on the small living colony he was now nurturing by his stove. The next morning, Silas Vane woke before the light. The cabin was freezing, the fire in the stove reduced to a bed of pale embers. His first panicked thought was for the starter. He stirred the embers, added kindling, and got the stove roaring again. He hurried to the barm box. He had left the soapstone in all night. He slid the lid open and put his hand inside. The air was still and it was warm. The residual heat from the soapstone and the stove, trapped by the sawdust and wool, had held. He pulled out the jar. The starter, fed on the potato water, had exploded with life. It was a foaming, bubbling, vigorous mass, smelling sharply of apples and yeast. It was strong. This was the day. He began the second phase, the implementation. He took the reserved mashed potatoes, which were cold and stiff. He added a portion of the roaring starter, a healthy amount of salt, and a scoop of lard. Then he began working in the flour. This was not the neat, dry dough of his Ohio memory. It was a sponge, a wet, sticky, heavy mass that clung to his hands and the bowl. It was the potato. He was alarmed, thinking he had ruined it, but he trusted the memory of his grandmother. This was how it was supposed to be. He put the entire heavy, sticky mass in a large, greased bowl. He warmed a fresh soapstone, placed it in the barm box, and set the bowl beside it. He slid the lid closed. This was the first rise. The barm box was now not just a home for the starter, it was a proving cabinet. It was a microclimate. He had created a pocket of spring in the middle of the Wyoming winter, and now he waited. This was the hardest part. He couldn't pace. He couldn't check it every 10 minutes. He had to trust the system. He went about his chores. He cut firewood, his axe ringing in the iron-hard air. He checked his snares, finding one rabbit frozen stiff. He chipped ice from the water barrel. All the while, his mind was on the box. After 6 hours, he returned. He opened the cabin door, and the smell that hit him was not the usual smell of cold smoke. It was the smell of fermentation, of yeast, of baking. It was the smell of hope. He slid the lid open. The dough had doubled. It was a living, breathing pillow, full of air and power. He punched it down. The dough sighed, releasing a cloud of warm, alcoholic air. It was still sticky, but it was workable. He floured his board, added more flour to the sponge, and began to knead. The dough was elastic, heavy and damp. It felt right. It had substance. He divided the mass into 6 large loaves, placing them in greased tin pans. He put the pans back into the balm box, rotating the soapstone for a fresh, warm one. This was the second rise, the proof. He let them sit for another 2 hours. When he checked again, the dough had risen up over the lips of the pans, perfectly domed. With practiced, careful hands, he stoked the stove, getting the oven compartment to a high, consistent heat. He slid the pans in, closing the heavy iron door, the cabin filled with the smell of real bread. An hour later, he pulled them out. They were not light, airy white loaves. They were magnificent. They were a deep, golden brown, with thick, fractured crusts. He set them on the table to cool. He took one, tapped the bottom. It made a perfect, hollow thump. He cut a slice. The steam escaped, and he saw the crumb. It was not white. It was a creamy, pale yellow. It was dense, but it was incredibly soft and moist. He took a bite. The crust was chewy, the inside was soft, slightly sour from the starter, and slightly sweet from the potato. It was, without question, the best thing he had ever eaten. The first test was a success. The bread was delicious. The baction of the balm box and the potato starter had worked. He could consistently make bread rise in a sub-zero cabin. But this was only the first part of the experiment. The real test, the one that mattered, was not taste. It was time. A trapper named Baptiste, a French-Canadian who rarely spoke, stopped in that evening, his eyes wide at the smell. Silas charged him double for the meal, and Baptiste paid it gladly, eating 4 thick slices of the new bread, slathered in butter. "This," Baptiste said, his mouth full, "this is pain de vie, bread of life." Silas nodded. He and Baptiste finished 1 loaf. Silas took the other 5. He wrapped them in clean muslin cloth and placed them in his safe, a ventilated pantry cupboard, which in this weather was as cold as the outside, but dry. The test had begun. A week passed. The temperatures dropped to 20 below. The wind howled. Silas went about his business, feeding his starter, making his meals. He cut into the second loaf. It was 7 days old. He unwrapped it. The crust had softened, but it was not mouldy. He cut a slice. The knife sank in easily. It was not fresh, but it was perfectly, completely soft. The interior was as moist as the day it was baked. He ate it, and it was still delicious. He had created 7-day bread, but the title had promised weeks. The true trial came 10 days later. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days. No one was on the road. On the 4th morning, the wind died, and Silas heard a desperate sound at his door. It was Baptiste. He was half frozen, his face blackened by frostbite, his horse lost. He had been caught in the storm, lost most of his supplies. He stumbled in, collapsing by the stove, expecting nothing but hot water. Silas said nothing. He went to the safe. He took out a loaf. It was now 17 days old. He brought it to the table. He unwrapped it. Baptiste watched, his eyes dull with exhaustion. Silas placed his knife on the loaf and pushed. The knife sank in. It did not crumble. It did not resist. He cut a thick, soft, moist slice of bread. He handed it to Baptiste. Baptiste looked at the bread. He looked at Silas. He thought it was a cruel joke, that it would be frozen solid. He put it to his mouth, and he began to weep. He ate the entire slice ravenously, the first real food he'd had in days. Silas cut him another. "How?" Baptiste whispered, his voice rough. "It is 17 days." Silas just nodded. He went to the stove and pulled the balm box closer. It was not magic. It was the potato. The gelatinized starches from the potato, combined with the lard, were a miracle of food chemistry. They were hygroscopic. They attracted and held water molecules, locking the moisture into the bread's very structure. The sourdough's acidity, meanwhile, had perfectly preserved it, preventing the growth of mold or the bacteria that caused staleness. He had done it. He hadn't just made bread. He had made a high-energy, long-lasting, reliable food. He had created a tool for survival. Word of Vane's bread spread faster than a prairie fire. His way station became the stop on the road. It was no longer a place of last resort. It was a destination. Freight drivers, prospectors, soldiers, and new settlers planned their routes to include a stop at Vane's post. He sold bread, but more importantly, he sold the knowledge. Baptiste was the first. He stayed for a week, and Silas taught him everything. He taught him how to feed the mother, how to read its bubbles, how to use the potato water. He gave Baptiste what Jed had given him, a scoop of the precious starter. Baptiste adapted the plan for the trail. He built a small barm box, insulated with his bedroll, which he would bury in the warm ashes of his campfire at night to keep the starter alive. The secret could not be kept. It was too important. It was a matter of life and death. Silas Vane, the failed freight driver, became a mentor. He gave scoops of Vane's balm to settlers' wives heading west on wagon trains. He showed them how to build a proving box that could sit in their wagons, using residual heat from their own cooking fires. The recipe itself became a form of currency. Vane's potato sourdough became a staple in the high territories. The bread was heavy, dense, and full of calories. It was not a delicate pastry. It was a workhorse. It was the food that built the ranches and settled the valleys. Within a decade, the method was so common that its origins were forgotten. It was no longer Vane's method. It was just how you make bread in the high country. Women in mining camps in Idaho and homesteads in Montana were feeding their starters potato water, never knowing the name Silas Vane, only knowing that this was the way to make bread that lasted. The ugly little barm box had become a standard piece of kitchen equipment, as essential as the cast-iron skillet. The knowledge had become vernacular, a shared wisdom that had evolved from one man's cold, desperate observation. What Silas Vane had done was not just baking, it was engineering. He had faced a complex problem: extreme cold, environmental instability, and poor materials, and he had designed a system to solve it. This system, observed through a modern lens, was a perfect piece of frontier technology. The starter itself was the first innovation. By feeding it potato water, he had selected for a wild yeast culture that was incredibly robust. The starchy, nutrient-rich broth was a superfood for the Saccharomyces yeast, making it hyperactive, while the Lactobacillus bacteria produced the preserving acids. It was a complex, symbiotic ecosystem he was herding, just as Sawtooth Jed had said. The second innovation, the barm box, was a masterpiece of passive thermal design. Silas had instinctively understood thermal stability and insulation. The stove was a point source of intense radiative heat. The box, insulated with sawdust and wool, buffered this. It didn't heat the dough. It captured and held a stable, low-level warmth. The soapstone was the key, a simple, brilliant use of thermal mass. It absorbed heat slowly from the stove and, more importantly, released it slowly into the box, creating a gentle, consistent microclimate. It was, in effect, a passive incubator. Finally, the recipe itself was a chemical marvel. Food science would later explain precisely why it worked. The gelatinized starches from the mashed potatoes, along with the fat from the lard, physically interrupted the process of staling. Staling isn't just drying out, it's a process called retrogradation, where the starch molecules recrystallize. The potato and the fat got in the way, blocking this crystallization, locking in the moisture, and keeping the bread soft and pliable. Silas Vane, with no formal training, had solved problems of microbiology, thermal engineering, and food chemistry through observation, trial, and error. His solution was as elegant and effective as a well-made rifle, a testament to the quiet, practical innovations that were the true difference between survival and disaster on the frontier. The same principles he had mastered, insulation, thermal mass, and working with living systems, were the very same principles that modern engineers and architects would one day use to design resilient, efficient homes. Silas Vane ran his way station for another 15 years. He became a fixture of the territory, a gruff, respected elder known for his wisdom and his peerless bread. Men would ride 20 miles out of their way in blizzards, just to sit in his warm station and eat a slice of bread that tasted like comfort. The small, ugly barm box sat by his stove until the day he died, its pine wood stained dark from decades of use, a quiet monument to his discovery. The starter, Vane's barm, outlived him. His niece, who had come to help him in his old age, took a crock of it with her when she moved to Oregon. Parts of that living colony, it was said, survived for generations, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, a living link to that cold cabin and the man who refused to be beaten. The way station itself is long gone, its log walls collapsed into the earth, its foundation stones scattered, but the idea was indestructible. What Silas had discovered was more than a recipe. He had learned that survival is not about brute force, but about understanding the system you are in. It is about nurturing life when the world is dedicated to an opposite annihilation. He had refused to accept the standard way when the environment proved it wrong. He looked at the failure of the old method not as an end, but as a question. He had observed the Shoshone woman's insulated basket, the old prospector's living mother, and the snowdrift's insulating power. He had learned that the most powerful tools are often the quietest: a stable warmth, a living culture, a handful of potatoes. In any cold place, in any hard time, the challenge is the same. It is to find the small living thing, an idea, a kernel of hope, a culture, and to be clever enough to build a world to protect it. It is to understand that true resilience is not about being hard like the frozen bread he once made. It is about being alive and knowing, in the face of all evidence, how to keep what is good.